Hi, my name is Peter Andras. I'm a professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 12, the evolution of science. This is part 1 of lecture 12. In this lecture, we will look at how science evolved. First, we will look at the science as a system. Then we will consider origin of science. And then we will look at how memory, information substance, and identity setting works in the context of science. So, let's start with society. As we discussed, society is the system of human communications, and this includes both, or rather, all written, spoken, electronic communications, and any other forms of communications involving humans. Now, we discussed in the context of society earlier that society reproduces, and in the context of reproduction of society, there is a subsystem of science, which is the system of communications, human communications, about conclusions that can be experimentally checked. So here the assumption is that you have two sequences of communications that should lead to the same continuation. So one sequence of derivation of conclusions leads to the same conclusion as another sequence of derivation of conclusions. And communications which fit into this context constitute the science subsystem of the society. Now, clearly, as we noted earlier, science relates closely with religion, and it is, and also with education. So we earlier mentioned that the religion is the system of the uncommon knowledge. So this is the knowledge that is used to explain things that are otherwise unexplainable in the context of the common everyday knowledge. And today, science and religion compete to explain these perceptions of society that cannot be explained in an easy or immediate way using the common knowledge. Now, this competition between science and religion has been there for some time, and more recently, science dominates the explanations of phenomena that cannot be explained using common knowledge. However, as we noted earlier, religion and kind of uncommon knowledge still persists, and there are parts of social and individual life where reliance on this uncommon knowledge is practically necessary. We noted that the education system of the society is the specialist reproduction system of society. And it is dealing with reproducing the communications that can be referenced by humans in their communications and provide the core references to these communications. So this is the kind of core common knowledge that education reproduces. However, education supports the reproduction of other knowledge as well in the society, including the scientific knowledge. So science, in this sense, it is reproduced in the context of the education subsystem of the society, and in particular, today it is reproduced through the higher education subsystem within the system of education. Now, if you look back historically to ancient times, you see a number of versions of ancient science. Greeks, Romans, the Chinese, in the Islamic world, in India, there were separate developments and of course of science, and of course this also interacts with each other to some extent. Certainly in the case of Greeks and Romans, there is a strong interaction between their sciences. Now, these ancient sciences addressed problems that people experienced at that time. So, for example, problems related to measuring land, who has what land, where are the boundaries, where could houses be built, how houses should be built. They looked at travel, for example, how ships could be built, how ships could navigate over the seas and so on. These ancient sciences were led by the practicalities of, of the life of humans. And of course, among these ancient sciences, of course, we should also note the kind of religious science, which is the science about how gods behave and how humans can communicate with gods. Because this science was part of the uncommon knowledge. It is one form of early sciences. Early Christian science, compared to the ancient sciences, was somewhat more primitive. So why Greeks and Romans would have quite a detailed knowledge of relatively abstract concepts in science, for example, the understanding of geometry, the understanding of calculations with numbers, various aspects of physics, the understanding of astronomy was quite advanced in early sciences. Compared to that, early Christian science stepped back mainly because the reproduction of the early sciences got disrupted at the end of the Roman Empire, during the migratory times, and the emergence of Christianity in Europe as a dominant religion. So these Middle Ages, early Christian science, somewhat was much more speculative than some aspects of ancient sciences. And in this context, the uncommon knowledge, the religion, explaining the unexplainable, that was unexplainable in terms of the common knowledge, expanded and dominated many parts of life. Now, this was present in the ancient times as well, but as the scientific knowledge got reduced during this upheaval period, religion expanded more and provided more explanations in terms of explaining aspects and experiences of life, experience of the society. So, for example, you may think of interpreting science as indications of the wishes and decisions of gods. For example, how birds may fly, what may happen to statues, and so on. Now, at the same time, there was also practical knowledge re-emerging and re-expanding. So this is the knowledge about the practical problems, like how to build a house, if you need to do surgery, how should you cut open the body, how should you restructure it, how should you measure the land, how should you use the stars in the sky to navigate and travel over long distances. So this the kind of specialist practical knowledge expands as well and establishes its own knowledge system. Now, with the use of writing, which has been there since ancient times, it is possible to preserve communications for later reference much better than simply memorizing these. So this expands the memory of human communications and of the society referencing these communications. And clearly, in the context of the uncommon knowledge, in the context of religion, written communications have been used for a long time. Think about, for example, the fundamental book of religion, take the Bible or the Quran or the Rig Veda or other fundamental texts that contain long collections of written communications about the fundamentals of a religion. Now, these religious communications are reinterpreted in a new context, which leads to the processing of memories and building up of kind of information subsystem within the system of religion, which deals with the processing of written communication of the memories within that particular religion. Now, this leads to the development of kind of systematic uncommon knowledge. So there are records of the uncommon knowledge, and these records are analyzed and reanalyzed, and derivations are produced, which are logical reasonings about this written uncommon knowledge, and the context of these uncommon knowledge, interpretations of this uncommon knowledge. Now, of course, this leads, the derivation of these reasonings leads to contradictions, and it leads also to solving of these contradictions. So, for example, think of Jesus. He is the Son of God, but he is also God himself. So how can you resolve this kind of apparent conflict in the reasoning that he himself is, in a sense, is his own father as well? Now, of course, this led to a lot of reasoning and derivation of lines of reasoning among theoreticians of the uncommon knowledge in the context of Christianity, and interpretations of this and similar contradictions led to a significant expansion of the system of the systematic uncommon knowledge. And of course, in some cases, it led also to wars, but there possibly very minor differences in the interpretation of these fundamental texts, or sacred texts of the religion. Now, one note to make here is that as religions move from polytheism to monotheism, from multiple gods to having a single god, you have a simplification of the religion, which also leads to the expansion of the religion and a significant elaboration of the uncommon knowledge, of the systematic uncommon knowledge. Now, in the case of polytheism, there are many opportunities for finding contradictions between what the many kinds of gods do and decide, which of course leads to elaborate explanations of this, but also leads to many possible interpretations which stop the elaborate derivations. By switching to a simpler religious conceptual system with a single god, it offers the simplification of the reasoning and also offers the much more elaborated expansion of this systematic uncommon knowledge. Now, this leads to the emergence of the science of the uncommon knowledge. This is theology. So this is the analysis, interpretation, and continuation of the uncommon knowledge. So this is the analysis of the fundamental books of the religion, writing further interpretational text, interpretational books on the fundamental books, and expanding this knowledge in a systematic, analytic way. This leads to the emergence of the theology, which is a science of the uncommon knowledge. Now, the schools which specialize in developing theology are the monasteries at that time. So the monasteries are the places where specialists of religious knowledge, the monks, gather together in Europe and develop further elaborations of theology. Now, in the same way, writing has been used in the context of the practical knowledge as well, to write down, for example, how land is measured, how geometry is used in the context of measuring of land. Again, writing down this knowledge allows longer sequences of communications, longer derivations, longer sequences of reasoning, and again leads to a way of finding contradictions and also to resolving contradictions by finding solutions to these contradictions. Now, really, if you look at early science or early systematic knowledge, one example is the alchemy, where the idea was that any substance can be transformed into gold by appropriate processing. Now, clearly, there were many contradictions found in this process because it was effectively not reproducible ultimately. However, there were also many solutions found because people came up with various further ideas of how things can be turned, how magic can be used in this process. So the practical knowledge gets organized in this systematic way, and this leads to the science of the practical knowledge. So if you look back into ancient times and then later to the Middle Ages, of course there is ancient medicine, geometry, the science of calculations, masonry, botany, which are written down in textbooks. So writing down in textbooks allows the reference of these ancient knowledge. To notice that many of the ancient textbooks got lost, and we know them only by reference by the ones that were preserved. That's how we know that ancient science was much more extensive than the science during the Middle Ages in Europe. Now, the schools of practical knowledge are the places where this kind of early science of practical knowledge is expanded, reproduced, and studied. So these are, for example, the ancient philosophy schools or the writing schools in China, where although the focus is perhaps on more theoretical aspect of this knowledge, like philosophy, or the writing and reproducing excellent writing. However, in the context of these schools, there was a lot of attention paid to the practical knowledges as well, and, for example, mathematics, masonry, and so on. So this leads to the emergence of science in terms of establishing the logic of science, which is driven by the truth. So what is truth and what is false? So what is true and what is not true? This is the core logic, the core code that defines what is scientific communication and what is not. So according to the systematic knowledge that it's in the system of this particular knowledge, the conclusion should be derivable as a true conclusion. And this defines the identity of science. So any communication that fits in this context, that it can be derived and confirmed in the context of the scientific knowledge, that belongs to science, because it is about finding the truth in the world that can be described by science. Now, if you look at the early sciences as subsystems of society, clearly you have uncommon and practical systematic knowledge systems, the theology and the various practical sciences. And these are subsystems of the corresponding knowledge systems, which are used to explain things in society, experiences of individuals and of society, and are used to support the reproduction of the society. Now, the defining logic, the identity of these early scientific subsystems, is that there is this scientific distinction between true and false, and this must be applicable in the context of that particular practical science or uncommon knowledge science to the communications, and if it does, then the communication belongs to science. Now, the education subsystem, as we said, it is about the reproduction of the society. Focus on the common knowledge, but of course expanding the uncommon and scientific knowledge as well. So the family education provides historically the largest part of kind of common knowledge education. Today we have more formal aspects as well. Then there is a religious education, which is again part of life of everybody, because everybody is experiencing things that they cannot explain in the context of common knowledge that they receive, let's say, through family education, and they get some exposure to the religious education, religious knowledge. And of course, they get also exposure to practical knowledge, through practical knowledge education. For example, in earlier times, this happens through apprenticeship, possibly within the family or outside of the family, where the young person would copy the behaviors of the more experienced user of the practical knowledge, and in this way he would learn the practical knowledge. So overall, these aspects of education deliver the reproduction of both common knowledge, religious knowledge, and practical knowledge. Now, as the theology expanded and became more complex, involving longer texts and more and larger volumes of complex knowledge, there was an increased need for more formal training and formal education in this uncommon knowledge. So this leads to really the emergence of the formal education in the context of religion, which is about training humans in the use of theology, of uncommon knowledge, to reproduce the theology and expand this uncommon knowledge. Now, in this context, there is an interpenetration between the education system and the system of theology, the system of theological science. Yes, education system delivers the reproduction of the theological knowledge, but through this delivery of reproduction, it gets interpenetrated by this theology. So there are new rules of education which must be conformed with the religious knowledge and theology. So this leads really to the emergence of formal education. So for example, in Christian Europe, this happens during the Carolingian Empire, where schools are established in association with churches. So a formal education is provided to a much larger part of the population, beyond of those who need to or who are intended to become necessarily practitioners of the religious knowledge. And this formal education, of course, is focusing mainly on theology and providing kind of general knowledge about the theological knowledge of theology in general to a larger part of the population. But of course, it leads to the incorporation of other aspects of knowledge as well, which way it impacts the education, moving parts of the common knowledge education out of the family education as well, and possibly also parts of the practical knowledge into the realm of formal education, triggered by the needs of theology for formal education. So this leads to further expansion of the formal education, and ultimately it leads to the emergence of the universities in the Christian world in around the 12th century, when the first systematic schools at university level are established to study advanced versions of theological reasoning, to really lead the development of theology beyond what was possible previously through the system of the monasteries. Now, in the same way, the education system interpenetrates with the practical knowledge. So clearly, there are similarities. Both the formal education focused on theology and the practical knowledge used written communications, analysis of the communication, derivation of reasonings, and testing of conclusions in the logical framework of the particular science. Now, this way, the similarity leads to the incorporation of practical sciences in the formal education, which was essentially driven to emergence by the needs of theology. And this expands the formal education by including education of practical sciences. Now, clearly, at the beginning, this includes things like numeracy and reading and writing, and a little bit of geometry, botany, astrology, and other parts. But of course, these get also studied in the context of the more advanced versions of formal education, such as universities, but also in monasteries, leading to further expansion of these practical sciences. Now, one key element of the impact of the interpenetration with the practical sciences is the idea of the experimental validation. So, while in previously the validation is done by logical reasoning, possibly multiple ways of logical reasoning, which needs to lead to the same conclusion, or a logical reasoning which leads to a conclusion, and further expansion of that conclusion to show that it is not in contradiction with other established conclusions. The interpretation with practical sciences leads to the use of the experimental checking. Because in the practical sciences, the ultimate check is whether the reasoning works in practice. So if you reason about how to put pieces of stone or pieces of brick together to turn these into a wall that stands and doesn't fall, your reasoning is actually checked by the practical experience. Will that wall stand or will the wall fall? Or if you build an arch in a building, you reason about how to build an arch. Again, the ultimate test is whether the arch that you build will stand or not. In the same way, all other practical aspects of practical sciences are validated by experimental validation. And this leads to the inclusion in the sciences that the truths must be checked by experimental validation, must be checked by checking what are the implications of the logical reasoning, and are those practical implications valid. So this leads to the emergence of the science which is similar to modern science, and which is the root of modern science. This is on the boundary between the practical sciences, theology, and education. Through the interaction of these, theology driving the development of formal education, practical sciences getting incorporated and changing what is covered by formal education, and impacting the concept of science by introducing the experimental validation as a key feature for the checking the validity of conclusions that can be derived by logical reasoning. So this new system emerges on these boundaries through the interpenetration and interfacing between these subsystems of the society, which is a science which includes the experimental validated checking of the truths. So to summarize, we looked at the origins of sciences, and we saw that there were many practical sciences, early sciences, which ultimately lead to the emergence of science. Among the early sciences, we noted that early theology and early practical sciences are key, where theology is the kind of systematic science of the uncommon knowledge, the science of deriving further conclusions from the established truths according to religious knowledge. But the early practical sciences are about practical aspects of life and the development of knowledge in the context of this, such as in the context of masonry or surgery. Then we discussed about the emergence of theology as a science of religion, where the expansion of theological reasoning and theological texts leads to the need of more systematic analysis and more systematic development of the science of religion, which is the establishing of the theology as a science in the sense of formal derivation of conclusions and complex and extensive analysis and logical reasoning to derive these conclusions. Then we discussed about how written text serves as memory in the context of sciences and how the processing of this written text leads to the emergence of information substance, which effectively constitutes the system of sciences in the context of the system of education and the system of society. And we also discuss how the identity of these sciences is derived and established by defining the code of the core code of the sciences, which is about truth, establishing the truth and establishing what is true and what is false. And finally, we discussed about interpretation and interface in the context of evolution of sciences, discuss how theology impacts on education to lead to formal education, how practical sciences impact on formal education to include these the knowledge from these sciences as well, and how at the interface of theology, practical sciences, and education, the roots of modern science emerged as that interface. Now let's have a look at a few questions. Is it true that theology was one of the early sciences? And the answer is that in the way how we discuss early sciences, indeed theology was one of these, because it was an early science of the uncommon knowledge, and in a sense it is perhaps the earliest science in the sense of systematic expansion of the knowledge base in the context of the uncommon knowledge in this case. Next question: is it true that early theology was a subsystem of religion? And indeed, early theology, it is the system of theological knowledge. It is a system of uncommon knowledge, and it is part of the religion because it is the information subsystem within the religion which defines what religion is, because it explores and analyzes how God and the related interpretations of society, social, and individual experiences can be used to expand this and define what is religious, what is true in the context of religion and what is not. Finally, is it true that the interpretation of education by theology led to the emergence of formal education? And the answer is again yes. So what we see is that education is mainly based in the context of family education for common knowledge. Then there is some experiential educations by participating in church services and also by participating in some kind of apprenticeship training. But really it is the need of theology for systematic expansion and understanding of the systematic part of theology which leads to the emergence of formal education, where the participation of humans in the religious experiences requires them to have a more in-depth understanding of the religion and some level of understanding of fundamentals of the theological science. Thank you.